Before we get underway, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Turrbal and Yagara peoples as the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today. For tens of thousands of years, these communities sustained sophisticated relationships with country, managing, harvesting, and sharing food across the region. So I think there are obvious synergies with today's topic, which is about exploring what just and resilient local food systems can look like. So I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and thank any Indigenous folks who have joined us today for the presentation. So we'll have project findings and recommendations from Kia and Joanna, and then Emma Kate Rose and Associate Professor Stephanie White have joined us today, who will be able to provide some comments on the research at the end before we move into a Q&A session. So with that, again, please keep on mute. Seminar is being recorded, and I'll hand over to Kia.
So thanks everyone to the launch of our report, Legacy and Sustainability, Co-Designing Regional Food Procurement for the Brisbane 2032 Olympics and Beyond. And this report presents a bold but practical idea that food procurement can be reimagined as a tool for the public good, driving social equity, inclusion, fair work, regional resilience, healthier communities. The 2032 Brisbane Olympic and Paralympic Games presents an incredible opportunity to transform South East Queensland food system. And that is widely being recognised when there's lots of debates happening across the food system around what this might look like. But in this report, we focus specifically on impact procurement as a pathway to achieve that. So this HAS partnership project responds to this rapidly expanding research and policy interest in understanding how impact procurement can drive sustainable and equitable transformation of South East Queensland's food system in the lead up to and beyond the Games in 2032. Impact procurement, for those of you who might not be familiar with the term, involves a switch to suppliers that intentionally create positive social, economic, and environmental impacts. It's proven to offer viable pathways to resilience and future food needs, but it has been undeveloped in the Australian food system context. So this report provides a preliminary stakeholder analysis of the food procurement landscape in South East Queensland and maps the opportunities and constraints for the Olympics to test impact procurement in public settings more widely in the future. It identifies a framework for mapping food flows and the social impacts of food procurement with a view to co-design future research and policy work in this space. Importantly, our report brings a renewed and much needed focus on the public good opportunities behind impact procurement, Olympics and beyond. All right, so where past Olympics Games have had a mixed record of benefits and challenges for sustainability, procurement policies have been widely shown to offer viable pathways to food security, decarbonisation, resilience, decent work, and social equity and inclusion. We know that food will be central to the Brisbane Olympics, with civil society having suggested a 30% local sourcing target as a key means to showcase regional produce and culinary expertise in ways that also improve equity and fairness in food system governance. However, there are numerous challenges. The food industry lacks resources and coordination to respond effectively. Farmers and Indigenous small businesses are under-resourced, and community voices are not at the policy setting table. So reflecting the Centre for Policy Future's interest in social justice and participatory policymaking, the project explores the opportunities, challenges and best practices in food procurement for large events in Australia and elsewhere. We've asked 3 core research questions, looking at different timeframes across this pathway. The first was, how does food procurement currently operate in South East Queensland? Who is included and excluded from participating in the system? Then we've asked, how might the Brisbane Olympic and Paralympic Games act as a near-term catalyst for social inclusion, food equity, health and wellbeing, and environmental sustainability across the food system? And finally, what could an aspirational long-term future for equitable and impact-driven food procurement look like beyond 2032? So very briefly, what is impact procurement? Well, we know that food procurement for large events is increasingly recognised as a powerful lever for delivering sustainability, regional economic development, health and wellbeing, and social inclusion. But large events, including Olympics, have had a mixed record of benefits and challenges for sustainability. Impact procurement involves a switch to suppliers that intentionally create positive social, economic, and environmental impacts in areas such as social inclusion, ethical labour practices, Indigenous empowerment, health and ecological wellbeing. The literature on food procurement emphasises its potential as a relatively simple and effective policy lever for improving healthy food intake, as well as advancing more equitable and environmentally sustainable agri-food practices. When it's combined with public or institutional policy for government spending, impact procurement has potential to shift food systems towards public good outcomes by defining what food will be purchased and where, from whom this will come, and what types of methods should be prioritised. Local food procurement in particular can be an effective tool for building relationships with local producers, contributing to local and regional economies, and reducing food miles. Yet despite strong interest from producers, distributors, local governments, and major venues, there is limited shared understanding of how the current procurement ecosystem functions, who participates in it, and what would be required to scale socially and environmentally responsible impact procurement by 2032. This project and the report establishes a new research agenda in which improving social justice in regional food systems is a crucial aspect of the legacy of large event infrastructure. This positions the 2032 Olympics as a catalyst for systemic change in the longer term, as a test case for institutional food procurement at scale. So while the precarity of Australia's food security or food supply has been well documented, the potential for the Olympics to catalyse reforms through impact procurement has not been the focus of existing research. To advance this field, our scoping study adopted a participatory, place-based and futures-oriented methodology to identify key gaps and opportunities around the impacts of food procurement in the context of Brisbane Olympics and beyond. We did 4 key parts of the methodology. First, we conducted a scoping study of best practices, looking at the literature and case studies around the world and in Australia. We also explored publicly available data to see what kind of baseline we would already have around where food is being grown, moved and consumed in South East Queensland, with a case study of the Scenic Rim to demonstrate that methodology. We then conducted a stakeholder analysis in conversation with key supply chain actors, government and NGO representatives, industry and health professionals, and academic experts to identify the barriers and opportunities for the Olympics to catalyse change. And finally, we've established an interdisciplinary UQ working group to advise and collaborate on future research opportunities. This includes experts from the Centre for Policy Futures and the Schools of Agriculture, Environment, Public Health, Business, Human Movement and Nutrition Studies. Okay, so with that background, I'm going to pass over to Joanna Horton, who's also been working with us on the project here at CPF, to start presenting some of the findings. This comes from the first section of the report, where we looked at the food flows coming from South East Queensland. Joanna, over to you.
Thanks, Kia. Thanks, everybody, for coming along today to share in the findings of this report. So, as Kia mentioned, the first stage of our findings is really to do with food flow analysis. And an established way of looking at food flows is to consider this chain of production, distribution, consumption. So we followed this basic structure, but we also expanded it to consider additional factors of seasonality, freshness, and nutrition, which are kind of entrenched or interlinked within the food flow. And we recognised as well that these will be key elements to consider in Olympics food procurement. So this diagram on this slide sort of captures our thinking around each of these elements. So for production, seasonality is obviously key for regional food supply of fruits and vegetables in particular, as well as other factors such as production methods and availability of agricultural labour. For distribution, shorter supply chains offer the best chance of guaranteeing freshness for products like milk, eggs, meat and fish. But to make this work, this so-called infrastructure of the middle, so things like abattoirs and cold chain facilities, really crucial and represent a key value add opportunity for agricultural regions. At the same time, there's a real risk to regional economic viability if that infrastructure is lost, and we'll go into more detail on that a bit later. Finally, on the consumption end of things, protein-rich products like meat, eggs, and fish are increasingly valued by consumers and will be particularly important to meeting nutritional needs of Olympic athletes as well. So this framework for food flows considers the Olympics, but is not necessarily limited only to an Olympics use case. It represents a way of expanding our thinking around food flows and what they encompass. Could I have the next slide, please, Kia? Thank you. So in order to illustrate how this framework might work in practice, we applied it to the Scenic Rim region as a case study. We chose Scenic Rim because it is a very productive agricultural region within South East Queensland, producing 1.58% of Queensland's gross value of agricultural production, despite being home to only 0.9% of the population. So we drew on data from the Department of Primary Industries to conduct some pretty high-level mapping of the region's agricultural production, and some of that is contained in the infographic there and also cited in the report. But really drawing down from that data, we identified 3 key commodities, being carrots, milk, and meat. And we mapped these onto the 3 elements identified previously. So seasonality as a really important part of fruit and vegetable production, such as carrots. Freshness is a crucial element for dairy products, and nutrition is relating to protein-rich meat products, especially in the Olympics context. So in the report, we dive further into each of these commodities and analyse them in accordance with these considerations of seasonality, freshness, and nutrition within the specific regional context of the Scenic Rim. And obviously, this will be a bit different in other regional contexts. Again, this is done with an eye to Olympics procurement, but also considering the opportunities to expand impact procurement beyond 2032, which we'll talk about a bit later. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. However, this analysis also highlighted some gaps or problems, including a real lack of integrated mapping that connects this food flow information with social good considerations. So, for instance, agricultural labour is an important part of seasonal food production, but there are also major risks of labour exploitation and modern slavery, particularly for migrant workers. I mentioned before this issue of the declining infrastructure of the middle, and this hurts smaller farmers most as they find it harder to absorb increased transport costs that come with, sending your produce to a processing facility far away from your region. This is much easier for large-scale operations and harder for SMEs. Rising land prices and supermarket-controlled supply chains also work to limit access at various points in food flows, both for young farmers or people looking to get into farming and small and medium enterprises. And although consumers are increasingly concerned about ethical food production, food flow analyses are lagging behind in this respect. And this includes the final stage of the food flow being food waste, which has been a major concern around past Olympics as well. So existing literature has highlighted the potential of short food supply chains to offer environmental, economic, and social benefits, including through food procurement. However, fragmentation and regulatory barriers can really stand in the way of realising the potential here. And again, the report goes into a bit more detail surrounding those. Being an initial pilot study, our project here is not necessarily seeking to address all these gaps, but rather we identify them as really important considerations for future research and policy making around food flows, including in the Olympics context. However, another important part of the puzzle here, of course, is the stakeholders within the system. So I'll hand back to Kia now to outline our stakeholder analysis.
Thank you, Joanna. So moving now to the second key question or theme of the report, which is around, can the Olympics be a catalyst for public good across the food system? We identified 3 interconnected components of the food procurement ecosystem that we wanted to delve into. And first, this is the food supply chain, which highlights a range of different key food supply actors in production, in distribution, and in consumption. But we also identified some key governance actors that are often left out of a more narrow supply chain focus. And this includes state government, local councils, and really importantly for this work, civil society. Thirdly, we identified a key range of social impacts, public good impacts that need to be considered when thinking about these food procurement ecosystem. And we identified these as health and well-being, food equity, social inclusion, social equity, environmental sustainability, and circular economy. So the report goes into greater detail then after having spoken with numerous representatives of these different stakeholder groups. The report goes into detail around the challenges and opportunities that each of those sets of stakeholders see when it comes to impact procurement for their stakeholder group engaging with Olympics, but also with food system transformation more broadly. Now, this slide just presents a snapshot. I just selected 5 of those stakeholders across the system to give you a bit of an idea of what people were saying. So the first group identified around that production level are small-scale farmers and agritourism operators. So we heard from them that many small and next-gen farmers are using agroecology, regenerative practices, and experimenting with agritourism as a way to secure their livelihoods. Yet we also heard that they've been largely excluded from formal discussions, receiving minimal engagement from government or industry when it comes to Olympics food procurement. So this risks reinforcing existing power asymmetries in food governance and undermines the long-term viability of small farms and the opportunities for young farmers in regional communities. Next, along the kind of supply chain, we talked to some representatives of global procurement firms, and they told us that the strategic value of local and premium products for elevating that visitor experience is really central to Olympics. And these companies demonstrated this in Paris 2024, where their early planning and established domestic supplier networks enabled really high local sourcing targets. Their global event experience positions these firms to design ethical sourcing frameworks, coordinate complex logistics, and translate sustainability goals into operational standards for the Brisbane 2032 vision. Partnerships with social enterprises, where they've got some strong history with this, and partnerships with using sustainable procurement technologies also show their capacity to lead in food waste reduction and social inclusion. Next, we spoke to representatives of cafes and restaurants at the smaller scale end. And we heard from them that their role is really in reaching consumers. And this is a real strength because this is where cafes and restaurants can influence consumer demand and supply chain norms and embed sustainability within that consumer culture. However, we also heard that this sector is highly fragmented, with approximately 70% of South East Queensland hospitality businesses being independently owned. And it's shaped by precarious labour conditions, rising cost of food, and reductions in consumer spending, which we're very likely to see only increase in coming years. So while many larger venues are evolving to embrace sustainability values and practices, the time and cost pressures orient smaller hospitality businesses towards short-term survival rather than long-term Olympic planning. So engagement with Brisbane 2032 procurement processes has so far been quite limited. Next, we spoke to representatives from state government and also had a look at the state government procurement policies. Here, the state emphasises legacy with the Games Legacy Plan and the Legacy and Impact Coordination Committee aligning programs across social, economic and community outcomes. Bris 2032 Olympics is framed not only as an event, but as a long-term transformation agenda centred on inclusion, sustainability, First Nations engagement and innovation. These priorities are reinforced through the new Queensland Procurement Policy 2026 and its procurement assurance model, which we detail in the report a little more, which advances purposeful public procurement. However, neither the QPP 2026 nor the GIRCA specifies how these outcomes apply to food, and there is no target for local sourcing specifically. So this is a real gap. Finally, we heard from civil society representatives. And here we saw that civil society views the Olympics as a critical policy window for transformative food system models. They advocate procurement policies that prioritise local producers, values-based supply chains, Indigenous self-determination, food equity, and social justice values. But despite their influence in shaping narratives and advocacy agendas, civil society remains fragmented and largely underfunded. This limits the collective coordination and the ability to scale local alternatives. One emerging pathway that we detail in the report is around Good Supply 2023. And this is already focused on impact procurement. And there's a scope there to expand to include food here specifically. Okay, so that brings me then, as part of the discussions with stakeholders, we asked about the current situation and what their hopes were. And within this, we asked what their aspirations might be for food system transformation at a scale much longer than the Olympics. So now I'll hand back over to Joanna, who's going to talk to us about the findings on their aspirational future for food system change.
Thanks, Kia. So yeah, ultimately, I suppose we identify the Brisbane Olympics as a really important test case for impact procurement that would ideally endure well beyond 2032 and become a major aspect of the Olympics legacy in South East Queensland. And this is where our work intersects quite nicely with other work on procurement, impact procurement, including the recent report produced by the Food Connect Foundation and MacDoc Foundation, which maps the size and scale of public spending on food procurement and argues for reorienting the spending towards social, environmental, and nutritional good. So that report, as well as this one, is in line with a very large body of literature, which really identifies impact procurement, as Kia outlined earlier, as a relatively simple and effective lever to effect change within existing agri-food systems. Obviously, public institutions have significant purchasing power, including the power to facilitate market access for small regional or Indigenous businesses, farmers using sustainable production methods, local producers, and so on. Impact procurement in public institutions also offers the opportunity to strengthen links with local producers and reinforces connections between people, place, and food. However, there are significant barriers as well. And the stakeholders we spoke to specifically mentioned a few things. So limited food availability, particularly in the local regional context. One region can't supply all foods year round, obviously. And that can be a stumbling block, particularly for large scale food provision. There's also a lack of networks between local producers and distributors and purchasing institutions, such that even an institution who would theoretically be interested in pursuing an impact procurement model may not know where to start or who to contact. There can also be quality and liability issues and price as well, being a major barrier if you can't embrace an economy of scale. So when thinking about how to work through or work around some of these issues and develop impact procurement, we consider the Brisbane 2032 Olympics to be a proof of concept or a potential proof of concept. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. However, this will obviously require a much greater degree of stakeholder coordination than currently exists. So as you can see in the infographic here, there are a lot of stakeholders, and Kia kind of outlined before some of the complexity of stakeholder priorities and objectives, which are quite distinct. So these, as we suggest here, need to be brought together through a more formal governance structure where everyone can participate in shaping this policy, shaping this discussion and the direction of policy. And we identify this as a really key focus for future work in this area from both the research and the policy side of things, with, as is suggested in this diagram, with social impact and public good considerations at the centre. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, so we'll wrap up now with some next steps for progressing towards this goal of using the 2032 Brisbane Olympics as a test case for impact procurement. In the immediate term, we propose refining food flow mapping to include public good and social impact data, filling in some of those gaps we identified earlier. We also propose investment in cross-sector governance reforms to support the 30% local target, specifically in Olympics catering, as a tangible and immediate goal. In the medium term, much more of the stakeholder work will be key, namely identifying the various trade-offs around food procurement for the 2032 Olympics. So for instance, ensuring supply of certain foods, as I mentioned before, might mean compromising seasonality or locality of produce. And we propose clarifying this in the lead up to 2032, again with public good considerations front and centre. And finally, the longer term aspirational future involves developing an inclusive food vision for the 2032 Olympics that guides impact procurement to deliver public good and ensure a lasting food systems legacy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Joanna. So what we'd love to do now that we've presented the report and the synthesis of the finding, which you can access online. I'll have the links to the report up on the screen in just a moment. I'd like to invite our discussants to provide a short reflection on the report, some of the highlights for them, some of the key takeaways that they have. I'd like to first invite Emma Kate Rose from the Food Connect Foundation here in Brisbane. Food Connect Foundation have been one of the partners with us on this HAS Partnership Seed Funding Grant. But I've had the pleasure of working with Emma Kate and Food Connect Foundation for some years now, and we're really committed here at CPF in growing this agenda and taking this work forward alongside the work that you're doing there in Food Connect Foundation with institutional procurement more broadly. So Emma Kate, I'll invite you to offer some reflections. Thanks.
Great, thanks Kia, and thank you so much for inviting me to be a discussant. It's so good to see this research coming out and really backing up what us in civil society have been saying for a really long time. Just on the procurement side of things, I'm just going to pop in the chat just a link to our latest report as well. I hope you don't mind, guys, just to give people context of the work that we've been doing lately. In terms of South East Queensland in particular, I think, our experience here in this region is, connecting with farmers, local farmers, regenerative farmers for, 18 years in a direct to farmer to consumer model revealed a lot of the gaps to us during that time. And we're now really working on taking the learnings from that with support from the research that you guys are doing. And there's so much to say, I don't know where to start, but we are really focused on, I guess one of the reasons why we wanted to put on the South East Queensland Food Summit in 2024 was to highlight those gaps, but also allow people in the ecosystem to see who's who in the zoo, basically, because the system is so fragmented, and getting everyone in the room together to talk around common problems and common opportunities was a really great outcome of that event. And we've got the next one coming up in July this year. So, get in touch if you want to be part of that. But it really did afford us a really good opportunity, thanks to funding from MacDoc Foundation, to be able to reach across the broad spectrum of the ecosystem, including people, the community who don't really get a say in their food systems. They're often the passive consumer of a very market-driven system with very little governance that focuses on social equity and environmental outcomes. And so by being able to highlight those gaps, particularly with the missing middle, as Joanna mentioned, the infrastructure required to connect small farmers with opportunities in procurement like institutional procurement opportunities, but also to the wider public. We've just had, decades of hollowing out of that infrastructure, both physical infrastructure, but also the coordinating infrastructure, the relationships that used to exist between institutions and food providers. So recognising those gaps is really important. I think we're at the stage now that we really understand the problem really well now, and that we need to kind of stop admiring it and start focusing on the people at the grassroots who are doing really good work. And this is where I would call for funders and governments to really focus their efforts into rebuilding regional food systems in the future. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, EK. And yeah, I think the synergies with the report, your Good Food Purchasing Australia report, are really timely. And I think these two reports can kind of be seen as complementary in lots of ways. And I share your reflection in terms of looking to funders to start kind of to focus in on the kind of work that needs to be done to look at where those experiments in these types of food future pathways, where these experiments are already happening. And I think the Olympics can be a really good catalyst for bringing that to kind of the public fore. But it's a much longer and a much longer and larger scale vision, I think, than just the Olympics presents. All right, second, I'd like to call on Associate Professor Stephanie White from UQ School of Architecture, Design and Planning. Steph is one of the members of our UQ Community of Practice, UQ expert group that has been working with us around this work. So Steph, I'd like to pass over to you for some brief comments. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kia, and hi everyone. And aren't we privileged to be part of this really important discussion and to get a sneak peek of this research, and congratulations to the team. I guess what stood out for me is what is so compelling in the report is that these changes or opportunities within our local food system won't emerge sort of automatically. We'll need to lean into the challenge and really make some decisions about how invested we are in terms of looking to the future about how this system is designed and governed. And as the urban planner in me, what shouts out in this report is really understanding that the system isn't a nebulous thing. It involves people and places as well as products. And luckily enough, when we're talking about transformation, we know who the people are now, and we have a greater understanding of the places where these things are occurring, whether you're producing food, distributing food, or consuming food. And I think there's many great examples that we can build upon. So if I'm thinking about places in the lead up to the Olympics, there's local hubs and nodes of success that we see, whether it's the global food markets at Woodridge in Logan City, where they have, I understand, like a 2-year wait list for producers who want to be part of that, and be part of that, the food market, but also be part of building communities and promoting a diversity of food choices. And what really stands out too in that local example in Logan is that local government's role as a convener and a broker of that, making places available, thinking about red tape busting, little things that shift, putting in some of the placemaking and public space infrastructure that sets people up to succeed. And by looking at these small sort of almost like insertions in our urban environment, can we replicate that? And so I'm also drawn to this idea of can we build upon our existing assets? So we've talked a little bit about hospitals as institutions, but I think we should see them acting more like anchor institutions. So what is their ethical and social responsibility in those local communities to give back? The hospital system in Queensland, would service, 40 to 50,000 meals a day across our state, but they're also wasting 30 to 50% of that food. So let's think about what are the small changes we can make. I'm a baby step sort of person about let's think about some incremental change. Can we just think about lifting a certain proportion of food that's offered into those systems? Can we just dial down some of the waste and some of the opportunities? So we don't need to wait for the Olympics. Last year, Suncorp Stadium hosted something like 1.6 million people. like accessing. So the infrastructure's in place, like where can we start having these conversations, testing and piloting as we lead up to the Olympics? If we scale, thinking about what their social responsibility is in a place close to the city, and again, showcasing those opportunities. So where we have those stadiums, from a planning perspective, it's much easier. It's one operator. We have Stadiums Queensland. There's major vendors in place. But could we be a bit more sophisticated and pilot some opportunities around precincts? Look at Southbank Corporation that governs a number of state-led institutions and private sector in a place that's also high profile. Can we start about thinking there about those places as hubs? And particularly showcasing the opportunity, just like Howard Smith Wharves is trying to do at a lower scale, and thinking about that. So what I took away from this is that there are lots of opportunities moving forward, that we can work smarter. And I think it's about understanding, is there a way that we can test and pilot as we build towards 2032? We have 6 years. Can UQ lean into this? We have a number of campuses, we have a number of precincts. Can we start piloting and thinking about how this sort of approach aligns with our own sustainability strategy, our own commitment to Queensland that we talk about? Can we be leading some of these discussions through our alumni networks as well? So just fabulous, really great work. Thanks, Kia.
Thanks very much, Steph. And I'm really pleased that you raised the point there around UQ and what role UQ might play. And I know that the UQ procurement office is a partner for implementing the Queensland procurement policy, and that they're really interested in the work that we're doing here around thinking about public good. But I think, your suggestion of actually expanded into make a connection between UQ and its campuses and how it actually sees its role in advancing that kind of a procurement for public good space is a really good one. I think that's the conversation we should take forward with that office. All right. So thank you to both. We've now still got some time for Q&A from the floor. I think maybe the way to do it would be to raise your hand to begin with, and people can ask questions. If you don't want to do that, put it in the chat, but I think Morgan's going to try and moderate this for us. And while we're doing that, I will just put the next slide up for you. And this is the QR code there for you to go online, and this is where you can find the report. We've also produced a 2-page policy brief. That's a shorter version for you all to kind of synthesize the key takeaways from the project. Okay, so happy to take questions.
Thanks very much, Kia and Joanna, for your presentation. Really great work. Thanks also to EK and Stephanie for your considered comments and some really great synthesis and ideas to take forward. I can see Robert's immediately got his hand up, so very happy to give the first question to Robert.
Yeah, well done on the report there. One of the things that I was looking at in this whole context, for something to be sustainable, is the financial elements that come with the food system. And those sometimes don't match what is expected through a food system or a food flow chain. And for that reason, I sort of look at time of payment from each transaction that occurs along a chain or a food flow can be quite substantial in some cases. And this causes a lot of small and medium growers to not look at larger supply chains that you have, so our major retailers or supermarkets, because they've extended out from 60 over the years, from 60 to 90 days to 130 days and beyond. And waiting for payment to come through is astronomically crippling for a food flow or food system. So it's something that needs to be considered, and how to have some governance around that moving forward, particularly with systems. It's just one thing that I'm noticing there, that was all. So often when I've done a lot of food systems and supply chain work overseas, one of the things we used to say is follow the money. And so we used to follow the money, a way of looking at things. So, and that was trying to develop the economic growth for all of the small and medium growers down at the lower end. The other thing that can come in and substantially change things is innovation. It can really shift things very quickly in a small period of time. And that is something that will happen and continue to happen through our food systems. But what are the KPIs that we're looking for in this as well? And so it's going to have to come across in terms of affordability, availability, quality and safety, and sustainability and adoption of that whole system to keep it moving into the future and keep it there grounded and have a long-term future. So it's just a few little comments there that I sort of hopefully picking up on the great work that you've done there, but trying to move things forward.
Thanks, Robert. I should mention to everybody that Robert was one of the partners that we worked with, particularly at the start of the project, where we were wanting to understand what kind of data was out there. So, Robert, thank you so much for those conversations early on, and I hope that you like where the report went. If I can quickly pick up on those couple of points, I think, your point about the financial sustainability is something that quite a few of the stakeholders we talked to did mention. We didn't zoom in on finances specifically, but certainly small farmers talked about this and this discrepancy in the power imbalances, particularly around supermarket contracts. Joanna and I are doing some work on this in a different project. But what was interesting is that So obviously we know that from a farmer perspective, this is a big issue. But when we spoke to those global procurement companies, they also really understood that this is a really important factor in working with those small and medium-sized enterprises. And it was interesting that my take from conversations with them was that this is something that's quite at the forefront of their thinking when engaging with those small producers, and as a way to ensure that those small producers can actually engage with the kind of procurement systems that they are operating. So it was part of the discussion what ethical sourcing looks like when engaging with small producers, but also Indigenous organisations. That came up there a lot. I think the financial sustainability piece also really came up strongly when we spoke with the small cafe and restaurant stakeholder group, who really focused on, look, while lots of cafes and restaurants saw themselves as being crucial to expanding kind of or reflecting consumer demand for ethical food produce from the local area, they were really clear that ultimately these small cafes are focused on the economic. It has to be economic sustainable because they're really challenged in that space rather than large restaurants or larger venues that have a different perspective. So the cost of produce, but also cost of labour and other financial questions was really crucial to those smaller and medium-sized cafes and restaurants. And for the Olympics, we know that not only will the Olympics be happening, but we're expecting lots of people to come into the region, with the hope then that for local businesses, small and medium-sized restaurants outside of the Olympics venues, this will also be an opportunity for those businesses. But I think there's lots of there's some concern there that those smaller operators will be able to actually benefit from this influx of people and demands around for local produce, because it's just really difficult for them to do that work without stronger supports. So really, they're very keen to be part of this dialogue and to connect with questions on how can they actually increase that local sourcing, strengthen their capacity to do local sourcing in a context of financial constraint. Innovation, yes, quick point on that. I think that's a great point. Maybe from our report, I might suggest or question, is public good, the shift towards a public good, a key innovation in food systems thinking? Is that a key innovation in itself? And I think from our side, certainly one that we think it is an important innovation, a values-based innovation that needs to happen.
Thanks for that question, Robert, and your response, Kia. Leah's got a question in the chat, just building on some of what was just spoken about. Often government procurement frameworks have payment timeframes goals within them, and they're generally much better than the supermarkets. And then a question that came up earlier is it still a requirement of Olympics committees to produce a food vision strategy?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Leah, and welcome. Good to see you again. Yeah, great. Look, the first point, I think you're right. The procurement frameworks, the procurement contracts operate differently to how supermarkets do. So I think that's a really, this is why procurement is such an important lever for shifting some of these structural barriers in general, because the contracts are different to the way that supermarkets operate. Is it still a requirement of Olympics committees to produce a food vision strategy? I'm not sure that it's a requirement per se. I don't know, EK, in your conversations, or Steph, whether this has come up. I don't know that it's a written requirement. However, we are certainly hearing from state government and local councils also that a food vision is something that should be on the agenda, or could be on the agenda. Civil society has certainly been talking about that as well. And we've seen from past Olympics that the food vision has been an important element of Olympics governance.
I would jump in there maybe. Yeah, I haven't read anything either way, Leah, to suggest that the requirement has changed around the food vision strategy. But nor have I read anything from the Brisbane 2032 end of things that is specifically oriented towards a food vision. So I suppose we're kind of there's still a real lack of information there. However, I think following from the Paris Olympics, quite ambitious and successful food vision, and then before that, obviously going back a little bit, but London in 2012 as well. I would hope that it's becoming kind of an established norm and would be the expectation for future Olympics.
Thanks, Joanne. I wonder if I could just add a comment, because I know that with the Paris one, I think they did that about 5 or 6 years out from the Olympics, so that Sodexo, who were their big food provider and managed the food provision, could start working on those relationships with different producers in the regions across France. So I think the timelines are kind of critical, because you can't release a vision 2 years out from the Olympics and say, oh, well, we're going to achieve X, Y, and Z without having done that piece of work, acknowledging production timelines and the like for farmers and producers. So I wonder how we get an answer to that question about the intent of the local committee and whether they are going to work on that, because I love your aspiration and I'd really like to see it happen, because that French one was just a thing of beauty to behold, really.
EK with a reply.
Yeah, so since the Food Summit we held in 2024, I've been actively engaging with the Olympics Committee, pre-Liberal government, post-Liberal government, and things have changed. And the last I have heard is that they are not going to be working on the food vision till probably 4 years out of the games. I could be wrong on that, but that's what I've been told. And that we shouldn't focus on the Olympics, that we should actually focus on other institutions first. And when you get that right, send us what works and we'll implement that for the Olympics. So that's the feedback I've received, but I could be wrong. I haven't spoken directly to them for about 3 months or so. So I don't know what the current situation is.
Thanks, EK. I mean, I think that 4 years out is, that's 2 years away, let's say, is 4 years out. And from our conversations with some of the global procurement companies who had been involved in food visions of the past, they really did stress that early planning was really crucial, and that's what made, from their perspective, this was successful. So I think this report and this piece of work in terms of where might this go next, in terms of research now, and engagement, community engagement, stakeholder engagement, policy work right now, I think the timing is really good. Even if the food vision for this Olympics is coming in a couple of years' time, it still says, here we are at this moment now where we can shape what that conversation might be. And I think bringing in a focus on institutional procurement makes sense if that's also the case.
Robert, you've got your hand up there.
Yeah, just another question. Climate and the risks that it's going to pose moving forward, because it's going to have a major impact on the availability and seasonality of the product. Now, it's difficult to do a precise prediction of what's going to happen, but normally our cycling across Australia is that we'll have 3 or 4 good years, and then we'll go into 4 or 5 years of very drought and then come back out again. That's tended to be, so understanding some of that and the procurement systems that you put in place to reduce some of that risk is going to be very, very, some forward planning there might be advisable to looking at that very closely.
Thanks, Robert.
Stephanie.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. Steph.
Oh, I was just going to add that it may be an opportunity or not, but the state government currently reviewing the South East Queensland regional plan and all the regional plans across the state. And what strikes me is there's an overlap of opportunity. If we could look at, if we take the glass half full, because two of the 5 themes are around agriculture and then tourism. And what strikes it, looking at those cross-cutting themes, if we weave sustainable food and co-design through those themes, there's some great opportunities, because there are other threats in the plan around housing supply, development and construction, which will, interface in some of these local governments, like the Scenic Rim, like Logan, if we take a place-based approach. So I think if we can get in and try and reframe and be part of some of those conversations that thinks about agriculture and as not just about export, but about how we make use of that as a resource here locally, that I think that's will be something we could lean into.
And look, I think it's a very good time right now, nationally and state level, for having these food system transformation conversations. We see it at the moment with the National Food Security Strategy conversations, parallel, South East Queensland food system and planning conversations are happening as well. So I agree. Jessie, maybe.
Hey, lovely to see you, Kia and Joanna, and thank you for presenting the research. It's fantastic to see. I just had a question around what you, after having done this research, what do you think good governance looks like for South East Queensland?
Thanks, Jessie. That's a great question. I guess maybe the first one would be a caveat on that, in terms of who says what food system transformation and governance should look like at all. And while we're researching in this space and active in that space, I think for me the main emphasis should be on actually bringing together a much more diverse group of voices to actually co-determine and co-design what that governance should look like. And certainly having civil society organisations, smallholder organisations, Indigenous organisations at the forefront of those conversations is a key step towards enlarging and improving governance, participatory governance. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I might mention something as well. Yeah,
I could go back to this slide too in the background while you're talking, Joanna.
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that important question. And I think Kia's right, but also I think it's good to keep our critical hats on around multi-stakeholderism and sort of co-design of policy. Of course, there are power imbalances even when everyone's sitting at the table. And there was an interesting study which is cited in the report, which was done into the process of drafting the 2012 London Food Vision. Which, despite the fact, that document is often kind of pulled out as an example of successful collaboration, but the study was a bit more critical of the process and pointed out that the large, as perhaps will shock nobody here, the large corporate actors and stakeholders in that process had a lot more power to advance their own priorities than the civil society organisations, and so perhaps, there's some, and without going into the weeds too much, but there are kind of mechanisms within multi-stakeholder arrangements that can try to mitigate that happening, which I think would be a really important part of any collaboration and co-design going forward. But yeah, also happy to hear from other people their thoughts around this.
Well, I will just throw to Leah's comment in the chat, which is about a call to action for people who are in the webinar today. What's the one thing that people should take away and look to do in order to keep this really important message going?
Thanks, Leah. Yeah, so look, I guess a call to action for people today, a key aim of this project was to catalyse partnerships and conversations that went kind of beyond what we might be hearing around Joanna's point around corporate involvement, EK's point around getting back to regions and smaller scale farmers and civil society voices being part of that conversation. So I think really our call was around what are the research gaps and how can we connect that to some policy advocacy. I think getting this report into the spaces where people are making decisions about Olympics procurement and a food vision, even though we're a few years out, is a key takeaway for us, and certainly the action that we are progressing, what might we actually bring some partners together to do some larger research next, looking at this as kind of a scoping report, where might it go into actually piloting some of these ideas, bringing people together to experiment with procurement policy co-design in this space. So I think for us, that's an action piece that's happening. So if people have connections with people who want to do this research and some funding bodies, that would be my call to action. Contact us and we can start to talk about where we go next.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kia and Joanna, and thank you, Stephanie and EK. We're at time now, so I just wanted to thank everyone for attending today. Remember that the report and the policy brief are available on the website with some really beautiful infographics. If you haven't grabbed those already, please do. And please do keep an eye out for future seminars in our In Conversation series. And thank you once again. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.
Thank you.